What's up guys, and in today's video I'm going to be going through how I'm actively using first principles in order to fuel innovation for Killer Chaos OS, how I'm actively thinking about this and also just solving problems. So like always with these videos, the mission is to show our builds raw and real, to show you the good, the bad, the ugly, what it is that I'm actively implementing in terms of mental models, how we're scaling those mental models into the future so that we can ultimately just build better and also create as much value as we possibly can, and also just to solve what hurts, basically to come in to businesses and organizations and to be the chief problem solver by building back-end systems that ultimately allow them to scale, and also just to call in visionaries, basically people aligned with the mission that understand what it is that we're actively building on a day-to-day basis, and also just to build a network of cool people doing cool things at the same time. So without further ado, I like to break this down into 5 steps like always about how I'm using first principles to kill chaos to build a back-end empire. And ultimately these are my principles, this is my takes of how I'm actively just implementing this. I always like to say that hey, most of these things we could be wrong about, but right now they're working for us, and we ultimately just want to use this in order to scale into the future and also just understand how we're actively approaching solutions and also how we're actively just solving problems into the future. And with that, we jump straight into number one, which is strip it down, which is find the core problem, which is ultimately super important. And why this matters is because most builders slap on band-aids on chaos instead of using first principles. And by using first principles, it ultimately allows you to dive as deep as you possibly can and ultimately just understand what it is that you're actively building. Because if you don't ask the questions of why, you're not digging deep enough, and you're ultimately just slapping band-aids that are ultimately just allowing you to have a patch solution. But my belief is that ultimately just using first principles allows you to then understand from its roots that hey, this is how this actually functions and this is how we need to scale it up into the future, by ultimately diving as deep as you possibly can. And first principles forces you to dive as deep as you possibly can by finding that solution, by saying hey, we know this XYZ to be true, okay, now let's reason up for it. Say for example, you're building a system for client acquisition. You know that hey, people buy from you because they ultimately trust you, and that is the core. Let's just say that's the core. And ultimately, how do you reason up from there to say hey, if people trust me from my referrals that I'm getting already, how do I now scale that up to get other people to trust me? And why do people around me trust me? It's because I'm doing XYZ and I have a high level of quality with the work that I'm doing. Okay, that is true. Okay, let's reason up from there. How can we then transfer this trust and this understanding that our clients or people that work with us that come inbound, how can we this now scale into other people to make it from one to one to many? And then ultimately just saying hey, we need to be able to transfer all these things into a format that people can watch and also just gain trust from, and ultimately allows us to scale. Say for example, this is now video format, and then saying hey, how I'm actively doing this as well is ultimately saying hey, planners say vendors are unreliable, but what's the real issue? It's ultimately down to broken data flows. So I built a predictive alert system that ultimately allows them to say hey, this is because of the broken data flow, and ultimately just understanding that hey, within your data flow, it's not the vendors that are delayed, it's ultimately the process or the workflow that is ultimately getting the vendors to you, because they don't understand how to actively just notify you that hey, XYZ is done, and ultimately that is the reason for the delays. Just an example. And ultimately saying hey, this is how I'm actively just solving for this, and saying hey, what's the daily move that I can have on a day-to-day basis, which is picking one surface level problem, just ultimately saying hey, this is a surface level problem, let me ultimately just ask why 5x times until I hit the root, ultimately just understanding it from first principles. And this is a concept that I saw from one podcast with Elon Musk and Lex Friedman, when he was mentioning how do you get costs of products down, which is ultimately getting the build costs, for example, to say hey, a rocket cost is XYZ without all the with the raw materials, and then ultimately saying hey, XYZ cost this much with the raw materials, how can we then achieve a closer amount to that and ultimately just build around that? And I like to take that fundamental principles and ways to think to say, hey, this is how we're actively just approaching our build, and also just ultimately solving the problems for our clients as well by ultimately taking the same approach and ultimately asking the key question of saying, hey, what's the fundamental issue behind the chaos? Ultimately understanding that, hey, they might say this is the chaos XYZ from their interpretation, but if we ask 5XYs to what the problem is and just ask good questions, we ultimately unlock a new level of understanding that ultimately allows us to then get to the root cause of what the actual issue is. It may, funny enough, at least from my experience, it's not what people think it is. It's always 5 layers deeper, and ultimately digging 5 layers deeper ultimately uncovers that problem and ultimately allows you to reason up and build a solution from that. And then ultimately saying, hey, rebuild from zero, don't patch, innovate. So I'm a big believer in innovation. I like to say iteration is the key to innovation, just ultimately just iterating and also just building from the ground up, because once you understand from the ground up, you ultimately have full control, and having that full control ultimately just allows you to have control over each and every single aspect. That way you can ultimately just tweak things as you want, and you'll understand how the system works as well, saying, hey, we are tweaking XYZ, so you understand it from the root, so you ultimately also understand that, hey, if we change it in XYZ way, it's supposed to react in a YXA way, if you get what I mean. And then ultimately saying, hey, why this matters is quick fixes die in scale. So ultimately, if you're scaling up, quick fixes aren't gonna work for you most of the case, at least from my experience, that, hey, having quick fixes ultimately just does not work, especially if you're scaling. For example, today I spoke to a client that was saying, hey, they want to scale, they ultimately just want to scale their operations, but the one thing that's slowing them down is ultimately just doing manual tasks. And then we were like, okay, cool, what is your current process? How can we actively build and understand from a fundamental perspective what the core issue is? And we ultimately just found that, hey, they're trying to scale, but they're doing things manual. And ultimately just saying, hey, we definitely want to help you in your mission and your vision and for what it is that you're trying to build. And let's just build a solution from ground up and ultimately just solve the problems that they're actively having. And saying, hey, real builders rebuild from ground zero. Ultimately saying, hey, we're in the trenches. We're ultimately just going to build from the ground up and then ultimately just understand so that we can have full control over every single aspect and how I'm doing this, and saying, hey, I ditched the messy notification flow, rebuilt it clean with Zapier plus Airtable to ultimately say, hey, this notification flow was a bit clunky simply because it had too many steps. So then I had to ultimately just delete, and then find what is the quickest path or what is the most effective path to get these notifications, which is 1 or 2 steps less, and then ultimately just deleting and then ultimately just using this new solution that we ultimately had by building it from ground zero to say, hey, why do we actively need to have 3, 4, 5 steps when you could just delete, and then ultimately just doing that through an iterative process ultimately just allows you, or allowed me to at least understand that, hey, we can delete XYZ and we can still get the same result. And then saying, hey, my daily move, what's my daily move that I'm pulling off on a day-to-day basis, which is choose one broken process, rebuild it lean and unbreakable this week. Ultimately just picking one broken process and ultimately understanding what the constraints are, because like I have been saying for the past few days or these past few videos, that you move as fast as your constraints are, and then ultimately just understanding what your constraints are and building from ground zero to ultimately just move a lot quicker. And then saying, hey, what's the key question that we could ask here, which is what's one system that that you can reinvent to scale, to ultimately say, hey, what can we reinvent that will ultimately allow us to achieve a new source of truth or a new level of scale that will ultimately just allow us to move as efficiently as possible and fast, by ultimately also understanding our constraints and ultimately just building a solution from ground up that ultimately allows us to then say, hey, we are building XYZ. Now let's pump it up to the next level and just ultimately understand what it is that we can reinvent in our current workflow process. And then saying, hey, number 3, which is super important, it's question assumptions, challenge the norm. I'm always a big believer of asking why and challenging assumptions of why is this true, why does this have to be true, and why this matters for example, is saying, hey, why this matters is assumptions keep the whole industry stuck. So ultimately saying builders break them, ultimately saying, hey, if XYZ is true, why don't we ask a set of questions that ultimately challenge that assumption for it to be true, that ultimately allows us to find innovation? Because you find it very difficult, or at least in my perspective, you find it very difficult to innovate if you're just doing one rigid way, and that way that things have been done for XYZ years. How else are you supposed to think outside the box and ultimately just question assumptions and challenge the norm in order to innovate? And by constantly just pushing the boundaries of what you think is possible, or at least what we think is possible today, and then taking it up a step further, ultimately, I know it's ultimately just going to lead us to a source of truth that is ultimately just going to allow us to further innovate and also iterate, so that we can have a new level of innovation in what it is that we're building in terms of systems. And then saying, hey, what I'm actively doing is, planners believe that chaos was inevitable. Let's challenge the norm by saying, hey, what if it's not? What if chaos is not supposed to be inevitable? What if there was a planner, or there was a process that will ultimately eradicate chaos, which is Killer Chaos OS, that we're building to say, hey, you don't have to face chaos, because it's not always true that you need to face chaos in your daily life. Yes, sure, it does happen, but you don't always need to face it. How can you then take predictive measures in order to combat that before it even starts? Always understanding that analysis is always better before having a reactive process to just reacting to things. Proactiveness over just reactiveness. And then saying, hey, what is the daily move that I could have? Which is write down 3 assumptions your niche treats like gospel, and then break them. Ultimately say, hey, what are the 3 assumptions? XYZ. What are the 3 assumptions, and how can I break them? By ultimately using first principles, by asking, hey, what is the fundamental truth within this assumption, and how can I reason up from there? Simply just asking that question unlocked so much new perspective for us in what it is that we've been doing, and saying, hey, where's the key question that you could ask here, which is, what's one assumption that's holding your industry back, ultimately achieving a new level of scale that you can break, and ultimately just innovate with your specific taste and style to it. And then saying, hey, number 4, which is ultimately test fast, learn, iterate, repeat, which is the infinite feedback loop cycle. And I'm such a big believer on feedback, and I'm sure I've spoken so many times on this, just pushing the boundaries. You need innovation, and you also need feedback to power that innovation with data. And I'm such a big believer, so bullish on that, to just say, hey, we need to make data driven decisions each and every single day, by saying, hey, why this matters is innovation isn't a masterpiece, it's a muscle. Ultimately, this muscle needs to be built up over time and time and time. And how do you build that? You ultimately just build, test, innovate, iterate, and then ultimately saying, hey, we need to make sure that we're learning, iterating and repeating, learning, iterating and repeating, or learning, iterating and repeating each and every single day. And ultimately saying, hey, how I'm doing this is, I built a dashboard, it flopped, completely waste of time if you think about it from a negative perspective. But ultimately, we learned something from it, and ultimately understood that, hey, if we're going to build XYZ, we need to understand that, hey, we need to build it in this specific way. And that's why ultimately just keeping on learning from your mistakes and what it is that you're getting wrong ultimately leads to a new level of understanding, and just allows you to build better and scale better into the future. And that's just my personal belief. And saying, hey, Figma overnight, I rebuilt in Figma overnight, and now planners love it. Ultimately saying, hey, we built XYZ as a prototype, now we're learning from it, now let's iterate it and let's repeat. Let's just keep on this infinite learn, iterate and repeat cycle, and ultimately just push the boundaries of what we think is possible. And then asking, hey, what's the daily move I can have today? Which is testing one new thing this week, small, fast, lean, quick. So learn quick, ultimately saying, hey, each and every single day we need to be learning, we need to be pushing what we think is possible, and ultimately just asking the question of, hey, what's one experiment you can run today to ultimately learn fast? Because learning, you never stop learning in anything you do. And I'm super bullish on being a lifelong learner, because each and every single day you're gonna learn. And what can you learn that will ultimately fuel the ambition of tomorrow, that ultimately allows you to push the needle much further than you ever thought was possible? I think that is the number one thing, tied in with urgency as well, is super important. And then ultimately saying, hey, what ultimately ties this vision down and making innovation count, ultimately why this matters, by asking this question, why does it matter, is ultimately if it doesn't move the empire forward, it's ultimately noise. Ultimately understanding that each and every single day we need to focus on the actionables that we need to take in order to push the vision forward or the mission forward in what it is that we're actively building, because if it doesn't, it's ultimately noise. We need to constantly just make sure that we are building for the future and saying, hey, what I'm doing is predictive alerts aren't just smart, they're shaping a new standard for 500k plus a year events. Ultimately saying, hey, we're going to build these predictive analysis tools that are ultimately just going to allow you to predict, hey, XYZ is dropping. How do we now combat that into the future? And ultimately building for scale and ultimately solving the problems of vendor mix ups and also chaos, and ultimately allowing a new source of truth to be true. And then saying, hey, what is the daily move that I could be taking today, which is link your next innovation directly to your bigger mission. So ultimately for us, it's to have $100 million worth of impact, also to just reshape industries, and most importantly, to inspire millions of people with what it is that we're doing in terms of building Killer Chaos OS and what it is that will be building into the future. And then ultimately just writing this down and saying, hey, this innovation needs to be tied with what it is that we're going to be doing into the future, by ultimately just helping millions of people, which is the ultimate goal. And saying, hey, what is the key question that ultimately ties everything up together, which is, how does your innovation drive your legacy on a day-to-day basis? And for me, it's ultimately just inspiring to wake up each and every single day knowing that we're building Killer Chaos OS, we're pushing the boundaries of what is possible, because keeping that big picture vision alive through the tough days is ultimately just going to be so exciting when it does happen and we reach that milestone. But ultimately just enjoying the journey for now and just pushing the boundaries of what we think is possible. And like always, I know we're still deep in the trenches, we're still figuring this stuff out. We're ultimately just pushing the needle forward of what is true and what is our unique source of truth, and how we're going to constantly just be pushing the needle forward each and every single day. And if you guys like this video, make sure to comment, make sure to check me out on LinkedIn, X, Instagram as well if you want to connect, and I will see you guys in the next video.